In all of the frantic discussion, heated debates, and hand-wringing about the NBA this season due to the declining ratings and overall state of the league, there's been a troubling trend I've noticed in how people discuss the NBA in comparison to previous eras. You see, you may be shocked to learn that almost all of the issues you think the NBA has now, they've had them before, and much worse. I'm not saying this to prove that the NBA doesn't have problems. Every sports league does. But acting like this version of the NBA is somehow a dark period in the league's history is honestly just a quick way to tell me that you either have a terrible memory, are very young, or just flat out don't know what you're talking about. To illustrate my point, I've decided to hone in on one era, the 2000s, as this is an era that many current adult NBA fans grew up with, including yours truly, and is one that is, I believe, greatly romanticized by a lot of fans. So, let's hop in a time machine and look back at the league 20 years ago, see how it compares, and also how it bears some similarities to the league today. Let's dive into some of the skeletons in the closet of NBA history. First, I think it's important to establish what the mood of the league was as it was heading into the new millennium. Following the departure of Michael Jordan from the league in 1998, there was a fevered rush to crown the next great American star, as there was a massive concern that there was no one to fill the shoes of the man who had been the biggest star in the league for at least the past decade. Sound familiar? As a result, many players from the 90s had to bear the burden of the label of the next Michael Jordan, such as Grant Hill, Penny Hardaway, and even Jerry Stackhouse and Harold Miner. And this absence of a new signature athlete was felt, as in the late 90s and early 2000s, ratings were down drastically from the previous decade, especially when the finals didn't feature big market teams such as the Lakers. Again, sound familiar? In general, it's safe to say that the league was in crisis mode for much of the 2000s. It was not in a good place in terms of perception, interest, style of play, and finances. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, there were mass layoffs within the league office. And the 2000s marked the only time in NBA history when the salary cap actually went down from one season to the next. Oh, and this happened twice, with a 5% drop between the 01 and 02 seasons and a 1.7% drop in the 08 and 09 seasons. There was also lots of teams that were struggling financially for the majority of this decade. There were countless trades that were made strictly in the name of lowering a team's payroll. And not because of any super strict luxury tax rules like we have now, but simply because teams just didn't want to pay their players. Just ask any fan of the Suns, Grizzlies, Clippers, or Bobcats/Hornets over the age of 30. And I'm sure there's other fan bases that would argue they deserve to be on that list as well. In fact, these financial troubles were so bad for some teams that a number of them either had to relocate or were nearly relocated due to the state of the league at the time. Remember when David Stern vetoed the Chris Paul trade? That was because the NBA had to buy the New Orleans Hornets off of their then owner George Shinn because, in David Stern's words, in the absence of any viable purchaser seeking to own the Hornets in New Orleans, I recommended to the NBA Board of Governors that the best way to assure stability and the adequate funding of the franchise would be for the league to step in and complete the transaction and assume control. Just stop and think about that for a second. Imagine an NBA team in 2025 being so undesirable that they couldn't even draw one viable bid. So when your buddy claims that the NBA is dying, point them towards the massive bidding wars and billions of dollars that NBA teams are being sold for, and how that compares to just 15 years ago. New Orleans weren't alone either. The Vancouver Grizzlies relocated to Memphis in 2001 due to a weak Canadian dollar and poor attendance in the team's final seasons in Vancouver. Seattle lost the Sonics after an unsuccessful bid to Washington State to update Key Arena using public funds. And Sacramento and Charlotte both came very close to losing their teams due to their own bevy of financial struggles. These troubles shaped much of the league's trajectory during this era, and this undoubtedly made the quality of its product worse for its fans. The early 2000s had a plethora of exciting young stars that seemed poised to finally help the league move out of Michael Jordan's shadow. Shaq, Allen Iverson, Kobe Bryant, Vince Carter, Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan, Tracy McGrady, Jason Kidd, and Dirk Nowitzki were all either in their primes or coming into their prime years. And yes, this list features some of the greatest players to ever play the game. But this unfortunately did not entice the public in the same ways the stars of the 80s and 90s did. Shaq and Kobe's Lakers were a massive draw, but Duncan simply didn't move the needle for most fans as a player worth watching. This was obviously not how I felt, but Tim Duncan never resonated with the general public as much as he should have, despite being perhaps the best player in the league from 2003 to 2005. And the proof is in the ratings for final series in which the Spurs were the Western Conference rep instead of the Lakers. And let's go back to Kobe for a second. It's important to address the elephant in the room here. In 2004, Kobe had one of the largest falls from grace in terms of public perception in league history, following his trial involving the assault of a woman in Colorado. I'm not going to discuss the trial itself, but simply look at the facts at how this impacted Kobe's marketability and public image at the time. This trial resulted in Kobe having to miss games, and sometimes even come straight to games from the trial during the Lakers' 04 season, resulting in a massive impact on a Lakers team that was searching for their fourth title following acquisitions of Karl Malone and Gary Payton. This massively hurt Kobe's reputation at the time, as did the departure of Shaq and the disbanding of the Lakers dynasty. This reached the point where Phil Jackson, Kobe's coach, wrote a scathing book in which he said the following things about Kobe. Kobe can be consumed with surprising anger, which he's displayed toward me and towards his teammates. He rebels against authority. I won't coach this team next year if Bryant is still here. He won't listen to anyone. I've had it with this kid. Until Kobe was finally able to revive his image in the late 2000s, he was the league's biggest villain, to the point where I genuinely believe it affected the MVP voting in 2006, when he arguably had his best season, yet finished fourth in the voting. The Kobe you know now, the beloved warrior, the icon of his generation, that perception only really started to round into shape once the Lakers traded for Pau Gasol and were able to launch themselves back into contention. Before then, there was a 3 to 4 year period where it looked like Kobe was maybe going to be that generation's biggest wasted talent. The MJ disciple that was promised that had turned foul, and was doomed to spend the rest of his career putting up meaningless numbers on teams that didn't go anywhere. Now, let's take a look at some other players from that list I mentioned before. Many of these players ultimately didn't have as much success with their teams as is remembered now. Yes, Shaq, Kobe, and Duncan all enjoyed consistent success throughout the 2000s, winning a combined 11 championships this decade. Dirk Nowitzki is now remembered as an ultimate winner and lion-hearted champion because of his remarkable 2011 run with Dallas. But what people seem to forget is that Dirk faced massive ridicule after his playoff runs in 2006 and 2007, in which he blew a 2-0 finals lead against the Heat, only to get bounced the next year on a 67-win Mavs team that easily snatched up the 1 seed, only to lose in the first round at the hands of an 8-seeded Golden State Warriors. If you've ever wondered why Dirk's 2011 run was so remarkable, it's partly because the larger public had written off Dirk as a guy who could be the best player on a championship team. Allen Iverson, of course, had one incredible finals run in 2001, but he only ever made it out of the first round in just 2 other seasons in his career, before being effectively done as an impactful basketball player after his age 32 season. Don't get me wrong, AI is one of my favorite players of all time, but I also think it's safe to say that there was maybe never another player in NBA history who benefited more from one game, or even one play, the way Allen Iverson has. Vince Carter, despite entering the decade as one of the most electrifying players in history, had what was unquestionably one of the most disappointing careers for a player of his talent. After an exciting playoff run in 2001 that ended in a heartbreaking loss to Iverson's Sixers in round 2, Vince never made it past round 1 with the Raptors again. He then absolutely tanked his way out of Toronto in such disgraceful fashion that he was booed in the city for well over a decade. He was then traded to the New Jersey Nets, where he and Jason Kidd had some successful years, but failed to ever make it out of round 2. something that very same Nets team did do in the years before Vince got there. Yes, Vince was an incredible player, but by almost every measurable statistic, he peaked as a player in just his third season, then never made it back to those heights ever again. Kevin Garnett finally joined success when he was traded to Boston in 2008, but this came after a nearly entire decade of uncompetitive and disappointing seasons in Minnesota. Following a trend, there was one season that was the exception to this, the 03-04 campaign when Garnett won MVP and made it all the way to the conference finals where he lost to the Lakers. Before this, however, Garnett lost in the first round 7 straight seasons. Tracy McGrady, on the other hand, famously never made it past the first round in the 2000s, and enjoyed his best statistical seasons on Orlando teams that were ultimately uncompetitive and completely destroyed by the injuries suffered to Grant Hill. Fun fact, Tracy McGrady won his second and last scoring title on a 21-61 Orlando Magic team that went on to win the draft lottery that offseason. Now, it's not really any of these players' fault that they didn't achieve the success they should have. And this is my point. If you're one of the fans that truly believes that player movement is a bad thing for the NBA, just consider the fact that the alternative is a league that looks something like this, with many of its defining stars stuck on bad and incompetent franchises for the majority of their primes. And so, for every great player in the 2000s, there were so many more who were defined by careers that ultimately never lived up to their potential. Whether it's 90s players who should have enjoyed their prime years in the 2000s, such as Kenny Anderson, Derek Coleman, Penny Hardaway, and Grant Hill, or younger players such as Steve Francis, Stephon Marbury, and Gilbert Arenas. All of these players experienced remarkably short primes, or didn't even manage to reach their primes at all before a number of issues on and or off the court destroyed their careers. You think Zion and Ja and Ben Simmons have been disappointing? Guys like Derek Coleman and Kenny Anderson were just as talented, and even more troubled. Part of this was a money issue. You think guys are spoilt now? Back in the early 90s, there was no rookie-scale contracts, so players like Glenn Robinson and Chris Webber could sign massive max-length contracts without playing a single NBA minute. Webber was even so bold to demand a trade after just his rookie season because he didn't like his coach. This was after signing a 15-year, $75 million contract and winning 50 games in his first season. Webber then went on to have 4 extremely disappointing seasons in Washington before finally turning his career around on the early 2000s Sacramento Kings. And this was one of the most hyped prospects ever at the time. Again, imagine if this happened now. Imagine the level of existential crisis about the mentality of star players that would ensue. And these guys aren't even close to the most troubled players in the league during this era. A common complaint I hear about the league's current players is that they lack professionalism or a competitive edge. Yes, rest wasn't as big an issue in the 2000s as it is now, but there were also a host of other issues that many players faced during this time that, if they were to happen in the social media age, would have had a far greater impact on their reputation and the league as a whole. Now, it's important to say that I don't want to appear insensitive to some of these personal issues that players during this era faced. And I'm certainly not advocating for the league's response to many of these issues at the time, including the very racially targeted dress code that was implemented. But the league's dealings with these problems were in large part a response to the overall image issues that the league faced during this time. These issues are, in many ways, what established the ultra-safe, sterile image that the NBA has tried to put forth now. Another complaint I see is that it feels like the league isn't as competitive, or that the finals in particular has lost its luster. Well, the 2000s had perhaps the worst stretch of finals matchups that the league has seen since the merger. The 2001 finals had an incredible Game 1, as mentioned by Iverson, but were followed by a largely uninteresting Games 2 through 5 in which the Lakers easily went on to win their second straight title. The 2002 and 2007 finals were some of the least interesting, lopsided finals in NBA history. The 2003 finals were fine, but were some of the lowest rated in years due to the lack of big markets and star power. The 2006 finals were competitive, but mired in refereeing controversy. We're getting there. And the 2004 and 2009 finals had some interesting storylines, but were both 5-game series that never really felt like they were hanging in the balance. That leaves the 2000, 2005, and 2008 series as the only ones I would define as either average or above average. These series were varying levels of competitive and interesting, but I would love to hear the argument for putting these finals ahead of some of the great final series of the 80s, 90s, 2010s, or even now. By decade's end, the Lakers and the Spurs had won 7 out of 10 possible championships, and there was only one final series in the decade that featured neither team. Coupled with a severe conference imbalance and the aforementioned struggles of superstars to consistently make it far in the postseason, and I hesitate to see the argument that shows that this was a super competitive decade of basketball, at least compared to right now. The early 2000s were marked by some of the most lethargic, slow-paced offense in league history, to the point where the league had to change its rulebook just to open up offense and make the game more exciting to watch. The style of play was largely dictated by slow, ineffective, isolation-heavy offense and a lack of ball movement, and this led to a homogeny of play between teams, a lack of spacing, and an overall lack of innovative offensive basketball that, yes, produced a great end-of-year highlights package for your team's best player, but was far less dynamic on a night-to-night basis. This severely affected scoring, particularly in playoff series, with it being quite common to have games in which either team failed to reach 80 or even 70 points when the final buzzer sounded. If this is a style of play that you enjoyed, then that's fine, but to suggest it was somehow more balanced or well-blended than it is now is a bit misleading. Something I hear quite often is that there are too many threes being shot in today's game. And this, I actually agree with. But not because I think we should go back to how we played basketball in the 90s and 2000s. Don't get me wrong, I love the mid-range and post-up as much as anyone. Kobe, T-Mac, Chris Paul, Michael Jordan, these are literally 4 of my 5 favorite players of all time. But I also think when people think of this part of the game, they're hyper-focused on these types of players, and forgetting how unaesthetic it looked for the majority of other players. The majority of mid-range shots in the NBA didn't look like this. They looked like this. And likewise, the majority of post-ups didn't look like this. They looked like this. According to Kirk Goldsberry, over the last 20 years, the NBA has basically swapped the mid-range for threes, meaning as many threes as you think there are now, there were nearly as many mid-range shots back then. So again, let me ask you, what have we actually traded to get to where we are now? Is watching someone shoot a 3 that much less appealing than someone shooting a long 2? When you factor in the lack of spacing that was caused by one, and the opening up of the floor by the other, I personally think I'm okay with it. And if you are still someone who says they enjoy the style of play from these eras, truly, that's fine. I would seriously encourage anyone to go back and actually watch some full games during this time period. Not highlight reels, but full games. Even just a quarter. Find some random regular season game then, and then find one now. I guarantee that you'll at least reconsider which one was more watchable. And now, we've arrived at the biggest issue with the 2000s as a whole. There could be a whole documentary made on the officiating woes of the early 2000s. And in fact, there has been. But to touch on them very briefly, the NBA's image was forever altered by the scandal surrounding former NBA referee Tim Donaghy and the conspiracy theories that sprouted from this regarding fixing games and hidden agendas from the league office. The 2002 playoff series between the Lakers and Kings will hopefully go down as the most controversial in NBA history due to its absolutely awful officiating. And yes, I'm saying that as a Lakers fan. Not to mention other controversies such as the 2001 76ers Bucks series, in which Bucks players went as far as to say on microphone that they thought the series was rigged. A sentiment followed up by Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban in the wake of the 2006 finals between the Mavs and the Heat. The Suns-Spurs 2007 playoff series was also mired in controversy, with an archaic rule implemented by the league because of the Malice at the Palace, in which players were not allowed to leave their bench in the event of an altercation. This led to ridiculous suspensions to key Suns players that unquestionably altered the series, and by extension, the playoffs as a whole. To say that these controversies harmed the league's reputation is an understatement. There are many fans who stopped watching the league altogether during this time, and the fallout from these incidents are still impacting the league to this day. Ever wonder why the league is so obsessed with transparency and getting calls right, even at the cost of the flow of the game and overall entertainment of the product? It pretty much all stems from this time period.
Could I be the one you love?
So, that was one giant ball of negativity. I wouldn't blame you for now thinking that I in fact hate the 2000s and all of its players. But this couldn't be further from the truth. As I said, this is the decade I fell in love with the sport. But if we're comparing eras, I think it's important to note that the NBA has never been more talented. On a nightly basis, you can see players doing things that I never thought possible when watching the sport as a kid. And the NBA has its problems now, don't get me wrong. No era is perfect. Every era has their flaws. And whilst it's important to discuss these flaws in order to try and make the game better, it's important to not let this negativity consume you. There's not some perfect era of NBA basketball that we need to go back to. Focus on enjoying the good, as well as the bad. I hope you've enjoyed this video, or at least learned something from it. And I'll hopefully see you next time. This is Ain't Got Game.